Richard Skipper celebrates. Every show is a celebration. Richard Skipper celebrates the best in entertainment. Each show, Richard delivers the artists you love, showcasing what makes them unique. Never gossipy. The antidote to a sometimes hectic world. Now, here's your host, Richard Skipper.
Happy Thursday, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Richard Skipper Celebrates. What are you celebrating today? For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. My show is all about celebrating life, celebrating art, celebrating artists, celebrating people, celebrating whatever we can find to celebrate in this crazy world that we're living in right now. And I am very excited about today's guest because we have the one and only Jim Colucci. Jim, I have been on the other side of the microphone when it comes to you and your wonderful husband, Frank DeCaro. So I am so thrilled that you were here today because not only am I going to celebrate you today, we're going to celebrate All in the Family and this fabulous new book that you have coming out, celebrating the legacy and the 50th anniversary, I can't believe it, of All in the Family. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But before we get to the fact that this book, which isn't even hot off the presses yet, because it's so hot, in fact, that I don't even have a copy of it yet. I want to know, what are you celebrating right now?
Oh my gosh, I'm celebrating that I got to work with Norman Lear on this book because I actually am in the middle of working on another book about the Love Boat and have been for years. And I'm loving doing that because with that, I get to meet everyone I ever wanted to, because just about everybody in the 70s and 80s crossed paths with the boat. But I got the call in January of 2020. Would you like to work with Norman Lear on a book on All in the Family? And I'm like, work with a then 98-year-old legend and sit with him and go, yes. And Love Boat went on the back burner for a little bit. So I'm actually meeting with Norman in a couple hours to sit and do a long TV interview about this book. And I just, every time something like that happens, I'm pinching myself. Like, I get to sit with Norman Lear and ask him whatever I ever want to do. You know, a living legend. I
don't want to change you here today, but we are getting a very bad connection here. This is coming across very garbled. Are you on a Wi-Fi or an Ethernet? I want everyone to hear every word, and but it's coming across very garbled.
Yeah, I'm on Wi-Fi, but I don't have an Ethernet connection to hook
now
up to.
Now you're coming across usually perfect.
Oh, I moved the mic a little closer. Okay.
Now you're perfect.
Good.
Great. So you were just saying that later today, this afternoon, you are going to be meeting once again with Norman Lear. Now, Norman Lear has worked with you on this book. How did this come about, first of all? And, well, I want to go back a little bit. You and I both, I don't know how old you are. I'm assuming that I'm much older than you are, but I'm a baby boomer. I grew up, this show premiered on January 12th, 1971. I was just about to turn 8 years old. I was growing up in a small town of Conway, South Carolina, and I am a product of 1960s and 70s television. If you can take our viewers back, I know very much what the landscape of television was at that time. But you can describe what television was like before that Tuesday night when All in the Family appeared on television with that disclaimer that CBS put on before everybody was able to see it for the first time.
Yes. I am a student of 60s and 70s television too. 70s television I was around for mostly for firsthand, but 60s TV was always on in repeats in the 70s and the 80s when I'd come home from school. So certainly I know that landscape. And if you remember 60s TV, it was fun and it was escapist, but it was often very high concept. It wasn't usually done in that multi-camera format that I Love Lucy had pioneered, because things had shifted by the 60s into single camera, shot more like a movie, like for example, I Dream of Jeannie or Bewitched or Get Smart, all shows I love from the 60s. But when you think about them, they're about witches and spies. They're not necessarily, and there are family comedies that are like Leave It to Beaver and stuff, but nothing is groundbreaking. Nothing is pushing the envelope. And on CBS, up until the moment of almost the moment of All in the Family's debut in January of 71, there had been such success with rural sitcoms that had started with shows like Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres and Petticoat Junction, and that was the ethos of CBS at the time. Hee Haw was CBS at the time, and so here is a network that makes a major break from its tradition at this moment in 1971, and makes a major break with all of television, which wasn't socially relevant, and decides we're going to cancel all the cornpone, which is what they call those rural shows, and put on this groundbreaking, edgy, multi-camera, shot like a theater piece show that's either going to sink or swim, because people are either going to love it or hate it. It's so different and so button pushing.
Now, I asked you for a photograph of you at 5 years old. And there was a reason why I asked you for a photograph, because I always like to go back to the 5-year-old self, because that to me is the purest self. That's that little boy before you start school, or just as you're starting school. Peer pressure hasn't been put on you. Teachers start telling you who you should be and who you shouldn't be. But little did I know that you were going to be sending me a photograph of you with a lunchbox. I'm going to pull up the picture here. And this sums up everything. There you are with your, the lunchbox is, what TV show is this depicting?
Happy Days.
Happy Days. So
this was in...
I'll go back to the picture there.
This was in September of 1975. I was 5, about to turn 6. This is the first day of first grade. And this picture really says it all. You're right, the 5-year-old self. I never really knew that it's so indicative of who you are. I look at that and I see a little gay boy, and I also see a little TV head and a nerd, because not only was I carrying my Happy Days lunchbox, and by the way, Fonz was everything in that moment. Happy Days was relatively new, and all kids wanted to be the Fonz. But I don't know if you can tell from my face, but I'm the kid who loved school. I was so excited about the first day of first grade. I wasn't one of those kids like, oh no, summer's over and school starts. I was happy.
No, I was the same thing. And I grew up in a TV household. Our family watched TV together. And what I really love about the era that I grew up in, and I'm so thrilled that I grew up at the time that I grew up in, I grew up at a time where there were 3 networks, as you did as well, and those 3 networks vied for the largest demographic. So those networks vied to get my generation, my parents' generation, and my grandparents' generation sitting around the TV watching television together. So when a show like All in the Family is beginning on television, it's almost a shock to the system that this show, which was so different from what was the usual TV fare at that time, if you can talk about the cultural impact of what happened, not only when that show aired that night, but the aftermath in the days following.
Well, what's interesting about All in the Family is that young people, particularly today, I think, get discouraged about how polarized we are as a country. And they don't realize that, yes, we are badly polarized today, and it's a big problem. But that's not necessarily new. And back in the late 60s, early 70s, boy, was there a culture war going on between conservatives and liberals, people who were pro-Vietnam War and anti-Vietnam War, the old guard versus the hippies and the flower power and all that. There was a real generational divide. There was a real left versus right divide. And here comes All in the Family. And it's got Archie representing the conservatives, and it's got Mike representing the liberals, and both of whom are supposed to be sometimes right and sometimes wrong. Particularly Mike can be right, but Archie not often right. But Mike was presented as having his flaws and his arguments too. But what's startles me about All in the Family, when you think about it, is today we all have our niche media. And if you believe in conservatism, there is Fox News for you. And if you are a liberal, there's MSNBC and other news outlets. And even entertainment vehicles, there are ones geared toward left and right. All in the Family managed to get both sides of the divide to watch, because they had Archie and they had Mike. And I don't know if a show today could do that, could get both left and right to watch. And even back in the day, there were people who watched the show and loved Archie and thought he was right, because they said, he's saying all the things that we dare not say, but we really feel. And, you hear Trump supporters saying that. Oh, he's saying the things that everyone wants to say. That's how they feel about him as their hero. And people felt that way about Archie. And then, of course, there were the people who watched it knowing Archie is the fool of the piece, and that we're supposed to see the foibles and the wrongness of Archie's argument. So the show was magic in that it captured both sides of the divide. Now, when it premiered, CBS was rightfully afraid of what was going to happen, because this was really groundbreaking. And they put this disclaimer before the episode talking about, we intend not to offend, but to show the foibles in human, blah, blah, blah. And they were really trying to almost distance themselves from it. Like, if you hate it, don't blame us. The show was not an instant hit in season 1, although it certainly got attention. And I remember some of the people I interviewed telling me that their friends would call them and say, you have got to watch the show. I remember I didn't interview Isabel Sanford directly, but she talked in an archival interview about how she was on the phone with a friend, Juanita Moore from Imitation of Life. And Juanita said to her, you've got to turn on this show. You won't believe what they're saying. And Isabel turned it on the next week and was hooked. So word of mouth was spreading. And then All in the Family had the advantage back in the 3-network world that you mentioned of having only 2 competitors in the time slot. And those competitors went into repeats in March or April of 1971. All in the Family still had original episodes to air because it only debuted in January. So they had this kind of built-in advantage where they were the only new show airing in their time slot for a few weeks. And so then they picked up steam a little bit more then. Then over the summer, as word of mouth spread and they were in repeats, they picked up more steam then. Then they got nominated for an Emmy, and as a new show that gets attention. And so by season 2, it was a bona fide hit. But it could have gone the other way. It could have turned people off right away and been sunk like a stone.
But it was also a time where shows were given a chance to find an audience. Nowadays, if it's not an instant hit, it's pulled off within 3 or 4 episodes. Talk about that for just a moment, and how the networks gave it a chance to find its audience, eventually landing on Saturday nights, which is where I remember watching it the most. And even though as a small kid, I grew up in the 70s from 8 years old until I left home at 18 when it went off the air, All in the Family, before Archie's Bunker's Place. But not really realizing, for the most part, what I was really watching and understanding, going back and watching those episodes now. We're going to talk about some of those episodes, and really getting today what I was really watching at the time. It was the humor of Gene Stapleton and Carroll O'Connor, and of course Sally Struthers and Rob Reiner, that really made that show resonate even with audiences that didn't necessarily get what was being said.
Yeah, I was a kid. As I said, it debuted when I was a year old. So I wasn't watching the first run. Late in its first run, I was sneaking watching because it was on past my bedtime. But I would literally hide. There was an armchair in our den that I could hide behind. And as my parents were watching it, and they were not TV viewers, but they happened to watch All in the Family. And so I would hide behind a chair and watch. I would pretend I had gone to bed and I'd sneak back and hide behind this chair. But I'd usually give myself away by laughing. And I don't think I was laughing at the political jokes. I don't think I got it at age 8 or 9, whatever, when I was watching it. But there's plenty to laugh at on every level. You certainly know Archie's a buffoon. and he's using malapropisms. And you know that Edith, he calls her dingbat to a kid. That's funny. Of course, I get an appreciation watching it. I got older in repeats, and I did find it interesting watching it with my parents, because it would be on, say, after school, and have it on, and my mother would say, "I remember this episode," and it would often bring up a topic that we wouldn't have necessarily been talking about. And my parents were somewhat old-fashioned and conservative, and yet they knew Archie was wrong, and it would start a dialogue. I mean, I have to sound so PC about, they use these trigger words like would start a dialogue, but it really did. We wouldn't necessarily always be talking about racism in our home at dinner time, but when there'd be an episode where Archie would be particularly racist, my parents would talk about, I remember when that happened, or when that aired, or when there was something similar that happened to us. And I remember thinking, oh God, this is a deep show. I as a kid, I laughed at the loudness of it, and now I'm realizing, how deep and clever and meaningful it was.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about you, and then we're going to get to the book itself. You grew up in New Jersey, again, a product of 1960s and 70s television, mostly 70s television, 60s reruns. Again, I'm older than you are. Where did that love of television come from, and what were your desires? I know that you're an actor yourself. You pursued a career as an actor. Where did that spark come from for you?
It's funny. I don't normally get asked that, and there is a definite answer to it. As I said, my parents are not TV people. I think my mother had undiagnosed ADD all her life, and she could not sit still through an entire episode of a sitcom. She'd be in and out of the kitchen and doing stuff, and she'd hear a line here or there and laugh, or hear a line and be disgusted. I remember Golden Girls, which of course I wrote about and is my favorite show. She'd hear a Sophia line or a Blanche line and be, disgusted at how sexual it was, because they were very, as I said, conservative. So they would react a line at a time. And my father only liked old war movies, and my mother only liked old movies. One of my earliest memories is coming home from kindergarten and first grade, and my mother and my grandmother, when she was still well and lived with us, would be watching the Channel 9 WOR $1 Million Movie, which would be some old film noir or earlier 30s movie in black and white. And when you're a little kid and you want to watch the Brady Bunch, to have mom and grandma hogging the TV to watch a 2-hour black and white movie, it just seemed endless every day. But that's all they watched. So they were not sitcom people. And really where it came from is that I have a brother who's a year older than I, who's severely disabled, intellectually disabled. And when we were very little, I came along and I started at some point doing things that he wasn't yet doing. And that's what made them realize that he had a disability. And so in order to stimulate him, they parked a TV in our room, in our bedroom, where we had matching cribs facing each other. And they had Sesame Street and Electric on. At that point, Channel 13 would play them like 5 times a day. And so I just was hooked on television from literally the crib, because I was always watching it. And I read before I was 2, because I watched Sesame Street 5 times a day, every day for 2 years. But it really stimulated that love of television, and that never went away.
Well, where did the writing come from? I mean, you're a brilliant writer, and you're a best-selling author, I might say, on the New York Times bestsellers list with your Golden Girls book. So where did the love of writing come from?
The love of writing came from really love of writing, and with a fantasy of writing for television, which is a very small and tough field to break into. So you end up writing other things. Even if you intend to become a television writer, you end up writing other stuff along the way. And you, of course, train as a writer and take writing classes in high school and college or whatever. And you write all different forms of media. But I just always wanted to be a television writer, honestly. There's something magical about the sitcom, especially if you feel like you're growing up in less than ideal circumstances, which I think everyone feels. It's a magic world where everyone's funny and well-dressed and attractive, and they solve their problems within 23 minutes, and nobody ever gets really that hurt. And if you just fall for that kind of device, and you fall for that world, and you have ideas of your own, and you watch something like All in the Family, and you see how you can stretch a medium to accommodate a message that you want to give, that something personal you want to say, as those All in the Family writers did, then you think, well, I've got my own personal story, and I want to talk about disability. I want to talk about LGBT issues. And you think, here's a framework to do that in that's worked so well for shows like All in the Family. I'm going to do that.
Well, you've been very, very fortunate with your knowledge of, I mean, you're an expert. You've become an expert on these sitcoms. But with networks like Reels, devoting shows to these programs, and now CNN, thank God, with the programming that they've done, you've become ubiquitous. Every time I see you there, I go, there he is again. And I'm thrilled to see you. So that's always great. And now you're working on this book on the Love Boat. Thank you for doing this. One of my favorite shows. And as a skipper, I thank you. So,
and as a skipper, and also the Love Boat was a place where Carol Channing made quite a few wonderful appearances.
Yes,
So,
and I own some of her costumes from that show. So we'll have to talk about that at some point.
Yes, yes.
But I want to get, once again, back to the book at hand. How did it come about that you got involved with this book? And, how fortunate are we that you had the ear of Norman Lear and everyone else involved with this project? How did that come about for you?
Well, I feel like I'm the fortunate one because the project originated with Norman and his company, and they wanted to celebrate the 50th anniversary of All in the Family, which, by the way, was January. If you do the math, it was January of this past year, 21. However, books take a long time, and COVID happened, so we're still in the 50th anniversary year. So I'm happy about that. But Norman's people came up with this idea for a book and got a book deal, and then we're really looking for someone to hear his stories and shape them and put them in book format. And that's the thing I had done with Golden Girls Forever. So I really feel like all I had to do was just my favorite part of the job in writing a book about television was sit and listen to stories. The harder part is when you have to originate the book, like I am doing with Love Boat. This was my idea. I have to go out and find all the people. I have to realize what the story is to tell about the Love Boat. Is there a through line to it? That's more of the full process of a book, because then you have to do all those other parts. With this, it was great because there's already a book deal in place. Norman is already a go to interview, and he's the source, the wellspring of all things All in the Family. And so I just had to listen to Norman and interview him. I interviewed him about 8 or 10 hours over the course of many Zoom calls because COVID set in, so we did it by Zoom. And then all these other writers and actors who many of, Sally and Rob and many guest stars who were still around and writers who were still around. And that's a joy to have access to the actual people who did it and be able to ask all your fan questions. And then all I had to do was shape it into a book. That's the last part of the usual process. So I just feel like I was so lucky because when somebody calls and says, do you want to sit with your hero, a 98-year-old legend, and ask him everything you've ever wanted to ask about All in the Family, and all you have to do is get it all down on paper and put it in a book? Yes, I do want to do that. So I'm
my arm a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was no hesitation. I don't even think I knew what the pay was when I said yes. I was just like, yes, and then we'll worry about the rest later. It was really, and Norman is amazing. And here he is at 99, and later today, I'm going to sit with him in a couple hours for an on-camera interview and talk all this stuff again. And he's
Will you please say hello for me and thank him for me? No, please do that. No, I want to ask you, first of all, if I'm not mistaken, in my research, I think there were 250 episodes of All in the Family itself. Am I correct?
That I don't know the exact number because I'm not good at counting episodes because a lot of times there are two-parters that they count as one or they count as two. So I never go by exact totals, but that's about right. When you think especially 9 seasons worth.
I asked that question because if, and again, I have not had a chance to read the book, so I am going blindly into this interview today. So I think that if based on what I've read, this book is based also, in addition to learning a lot about the history of this, on 50 of what he thinks are the iconic episodes of the show. Am I correct on that?
Yes, and there's a little more than that too, because a lot of times we end up kind of touching on other episodes that aren't covered in the main 50. But honestly, I've learned from girls, there's so much good stuff to say about iconic shows that if you tried to cover all 250 of a show, you'd end up writing a crazy person's manifesto that would be 2,000 pages long, and it would be like a dictionary that you'd have to haul around in a wheelbarrow. So a lot of times what I did with Golden Girls Forever is I picked not only the most famous episodes that people expect to read about, but also episodes that there's a backstory about the production of the episode that's very illustrative of what it was like to make the show. And so you try to find, as I said with The Love Boat, you try to find a through line about the show, not just the nitty gritty of this happened in this episode, this happened in this episode, but when you read the book, that you get a sense of what it was like in the beginning of making this show, how it progressed, how it declined, how it got canceled. And so that's what Norman and I did. What our first order of business was, okay, we're going to pick a certain number of episodes that tell the story of All in the Family. It'll be all the moments that fans want, certainly. So we got to pick those. But also maybe there's an episode that you didn't know that something really major happened behind the scenes that affected the life of the show. And 50 sounded like a good number since it's the 50th anniversary.
Absolutely. And was this done in a linear fashion as far as the episodes are concerned, or do you jump around in the episodes? Was there a particular episode that really surprised you, or one that I'm asking a lot of questions, I know. We'll wrap this up. Or was something that jumped out at you that you had forgotten about as far as a certain episode was concerned?
It's pretty linear in that we do go season to season, episode by episode for the episodes that we cover. I tried to cover enough per season so that you get a flavor of what was going that year also. So we wanted to make it very indicative. And as far as surprising, I can't say almost every episode of All in the Family surprises me because, for example, I've seen the episode so many times, but I didn't ever sit and think about the timing of it. There's an episode in the first season, the 5th episode of the whole series, called Judging Books by Covers, in which Mike brings home his friend, Roger, played by Anthony Geary. And Archie has never liked Roger because he calls him Roger the Fairy and says that he must be gay and makes all these gay jokes about Roger. We never actually find out in the episode if Roger is gay. But the punchline of the episode, which is so brilliant, is that Archie makes a big stink about, oh, Mike has this gay friend. I can't believe he brought him down to Kelsey's bar where people know me, and it's so embarrassing. And it turns out that Archie's longtime buddy, who's always hanging out at Archie's bar, arm wrestling with Archie, is the gay one. We don't know about Roger, but Archie's macho friend is gay, and Archie gets a comeuppance because, again, he assumed things, judging books by covers. Now, I always knew that was groundbreaking because I had watched a lot of 60s and 70s TV, and they didn't have gay characters on I Dream of Jeannie that were out, or they didn't have them on, they had them on I Dream of Jeannie and other shows that when they were coded as gay, and on Bewitched, there was Uncle Arthur, but there was never an out discussion of homosexuality. But now I realize if that was the 5th episode of the whole series, this was early 1971. That's how early it was. And here's a show that was debuting on very unsteady ground because it could have gotten canceled for being too controversial. And episode 5, bang, they're going into one of the most controversial areas you can go into, and they had their way with it. And so I'm surprised by things like that. Just it's the appreciation of every time we talk about an episode that had a social impact, you realize that it was almost always the first time it was discussed on television. And you realize, God, how early that was to be talking about it, and how ballsy they were to bring up that topic, and how they had to fight CBS to get it on the air. And now it's considered a classic.
I never get tired of watching the show. And even going back and watching the shows now, I glean something new each time I see them. And out of all of the episodes, was there one particular episode that turns out to be the most controversial episode that almost didn't make it to air?
There were ones that almost didn't make it to air that you think, now, why was that controversial? Like talking about menopause for Edith. Things that today we do discuss more openly. Then there are other episodes that they say things that you could never say today. And so it's kind of the reverse. Occasionally, they also often used euphemisms, but they did use the N-word. They would have George use it, particularly. George Jefferson. And so that couldn't happen today. So that's surprising. So yeah, there's always a moment. You say you love watching them. Me too. And I really, as part of the exercise, only had to watch the 50 or so episodes that Norm and I were going to concentrate on. But by the time I sat down with Norman, I had gotten hooked again and just got blown through the whole box set and watched everything again, because it's just fun. And also it helps be more informed for when I'm interviewing him. But there's nuggets in just about every episode. There, like any sitcom, maybe there are a few clungers, but there's, even in an episode that isn't meaning to be groundbreaking, there's often a moment where something happens that you think that's actually important. Edith stood up to him, or Gloria said something that had never been said before. There's a little nugget in just about every one.
Was there anything what was your biggest takeaway from being able to interview Norman Lear about the series itself, as far as the years that the show ran, before, of course, Archie Bunker's place? What was the biggest obstacle that he faced from beginning to end once the show got off and running? What did he face year after year having to keep this show on the air?
Well, with any sitcom that tries to break ground, they often have the same struggle, which is, in the beginning, when you're a fledgling show, the network wants you to play nice and not rock the boat. But the problem is, playing nice and not rocking the boat doesn't often get you viewers as much as being controversial. So there's always a conflicting agenda there, where the network wants you to be a hit but be safe, and you want, to be a hit, you need to change the medium to be edgy. And so Norman had that with CBS several times. They didn't want to air what ended up airing as the first episode, and it was written as the first episode. CBS didn't want to air that first because they thought it was too controversial. It went too many places. It used too many epithets. Let's air this nice, safer third episode and make that the pilot. And Norman went down to the wire. Oh, I'm sorry, I dropped my microphone. Norman went down to the wire with CBS. Mic drop. Yeah, that's how enthused I was. Norman went down to the wire with CBS, fighting that battle to the point where the show almost didn't premiere, because it was, which button does CBS push? Do they air the one I want them to air? Do they air the other one? So there were battles like that. And as Norman said about that first episode, the reason he wanted that one to be first was because it touched so many areas. He said, if you're going to go on this journey with me, you got to dive in. You can't be tepid about it. You can't be timid. It's all or nothing, and you have to get wet. And he said this episode, the first episode, dives right in, and you can't get wetter than wet. Once you show that first episode, that's what the audience knows they're going to get from this show. So he had to fight that, and he honestly had his battles with Carroll O'Connor that he's very open about, and he loves Carroll O'Connor to this day, talks about him and gets weepy. But Carroll was a very strong force, had a lot of input into Archie and to Archie's benefit, because Carroll was brilliant and a good writer, a really good writer himself. But often there would be, Archie wouldn't do that, or it would more often be that Carroll, who, if you ever see him interviewed at character, you realize what an erudite man he really was. He was a student of Irish theater, and he was very educated. He was not Archie Bunker. And what magic it was that he became Archie Bunker. But there would be, I think, in the beginning of week, at what they would call the table read, which is, in a sitcom, it's on day one of the production week. And that's when the actors literally sit around a table with the script open and read the lines aloud for the first time. And based on that, whether it gets laughs or it works or whatever, then the writers go off and keep changing things. But that table read is the first time that anybody hears that episode, a version of it, out loud. And Carroll would often balk after that table read and say, I can't do this. This is a terrible episode, or this isn't for me, or this isn't right for Archie. And a lot of times it would just be panic, because this was the learned man reacting to Archie, because he hadn't yet become Archie. There was a weird alchemy that happened through the week that Norman would often talk about, that on day 3 or 4 of this 5-day production week, Carroll would suddenly go through the looking glass and become Archie. And from then on, through the taping, he would be much more in character, and he would have basically found Archie's voice. But every week, I think he had a panic that he wasn't going to be able to find Archie within himself. So that's a very actorly worry. There's a lot of pressure on you when you're carrying a high-profile show like this. So Norman had battles on a lot of fronts, and not only did he win them by being one of the gutsiest producers ever, he would have the guts to tell CBS, all right, well, don't air the episode, but then I quit, and I'll be in Fiji, and when you change your mind and you want a show again, then call me. And CBS back down. And in just about every case, there would be little compromises about wording here or there that he would make as a gesture, but he basically won all the major battles. And then he was able not only to fight off CBS with one hand, but with the other hand, he was able to build an empire and create all these other shows that broke ground. The Jeffersons, Good Times, Sanford and Son, One Day at a Time. The man owned television in the 70s. He was he and Bud Yorkin were a two-man empire.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, do you have, I mean, we talk about the 50 episodes. What are your top 5? Do you have your favorite episodes?
I do. And, some of them are biased by the fact that I'm a gay man. So I love judging books by covers. I love all 3 episodes, particularly the first and the third episode in which Beverly LaSalle appears. And she was the drag queen whom Archie saves via mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in the episode Archie the Hero. And the beautiful thing about it is not only, yes, they make their jokes about drag queens, and that's fine, but Beverly LaSalle, from moment one, has dignity and agency, as they say in today's terms. She's not just the butt of the joke. She's a person. She one-ups Archie. She is not just to be laughed at. She's respected by Mike and Gloria and Edith, and even begrudgingly by Archie. She becomes one of Edith's best friends, which is such a beautiful idea to show another dimension of Edith, because she's not just a dingbat. She's pure love. That's what Norman always envisioned her as his own mother and his own grandmother, really, who he said was pure love. And so Edith was she was a true Christian. She was non-judgmental Christianity in its best form. And so to see the third episode,
faith, when her Christianity is tested in that
third episode, yes. So that third episode, the second part, it's a 2-parter, Edith's Crisis of Faith, where Beverly is killed in a hate crime, and it makes Edith question, how could there be a God who would let this happen? What sitcom questions? How could there could be a God that could let this happen? That's taking on a lot of territory for a sitcom, and they did it so beautifully. Thanks to the writing and thanks to Gene Stapleton and thanks to the love we had built for Beverly LaSalle and Laurie Shannon, the actor who played her. So those are some favorites. The episode where Edith is nearly raped. It's weird to say that's a favorite because it was traumatizing. Yeah, but it was a traumatizing episode, but it's a fan favorite because not only does Edith not get raped and is able to escape her attacker, but it really hits home and shows you how that could happen to anybody. And it's not just the stigmas that were around about rape, particularly back then, that it was a woman who was asking for it or who was, too sexually provocative and she deserved it. There were people who believed that crap. And here it was, no, this is a sweet, innocent woman who's basically your mom, and she could be attacked in her own home. And, she escaped. We're happy she escaped. It was a great moment. The audience went nuts when she threw that hot birthday cake in the attacker's face and escaped the house. So we all remember that moment. But another moment we all remember, Sammy Davis Jr. giving Archie a kiss on the cheek. That's another favorite of mine and of everyone's, because it's a big star and he's getting the best of Archie. There are so many moments where the audience went wild and you at home go wild because it makes your heart leap when some of these great things happen.
And the Christmas episode where they are out west and they find out that Gloria and Mike are getting a divorce. I mean, it's heartbreaking. Yes. I mean,
it is.
Because this is a family that we've lived with for so many years. If you don't have any empathy for that family or you don't feel anything for that family, you're not gonna feel anything, and it really gets you on so many levels. What is your biggest? I mean, when after completing this book, the book is now ready to give birth.
And the reason why you don't have it, I think, is it's probably a lot of the copies are floating out at sea, waiting to be unloaded with so many other consumer goods. So I'm sorry, it's been delayed a little bit. It comes out now November 2nd, and I do believe they will make that date because I think it is being unloaded probably as we speak. But the book was originally intended for October, so yes, it's going to be hot off the presses any minute.
I did get a notification that I should be receiving mine on November 2nd. So good. What is your hope and your takeaway that you hope that people will take away with this book? I can't wait to have it in my hands.
Well, I think that for people who know All in the Family and are fans and know it well, what's going to be great is you're going to find out so much you didn't know. Backstory. There are, and that's just in words. There are great script pages and photos and notes and costume sketches in this book that I got to go to Norman's house, and they brought out from storage boxes, 30 file boxes that had not been opened in almost 50 years, because they literally would get letters, put them in files, put them in boxes, and send them off to offsite storage. So they brought them to Norman's house, to the guest house, and this was during COVID. And I sat in Norman's guest house and opened dusty boxes that had not been opened for 50 years, and was like a kid in a candy store. And I was like, I want this for the book, and I want that for the book, and stuff nobody had ever seen. It was incredible. And then I sat with Norman after and talked about it, and it was one of the days I'll never forget. But for the fan, there's all those goodies. What I think I also want people to remember, and fans will know this, but younger people, this is for them too. And I want them to know that TV wasn't always trying to break ground, and TV wasn't always helping us progress as a nation and as a society, and bringing up ideas that needed to be discussed until All in the Family. Mm-hmm. And appreciate this show. And if you're young and you weren't around when it was first on, go back and watch it, because you will be floored by how topical some of the issues still are, how important they still are, and how they were talking about them 50 years ago. And I think the appreciation for that is what I want people to get.
Now, you not only got the opportunity to sit down and talk with Norman, but you've also mentioned that you got the opportunity to speak with other cast members. Let's start with Rob Reiner, and your biggest takeaway from talking with Rob Reiner on the book.
What's fascinating about Rob Reiner is that this was only one of the many amazing things he has done in his career. So a lot of times when I sit with classic sitcom stars and talk about their great show, and it's that maybe they only did one great show and they're known for it, and it'll be on their tombstone and in their obituary. In this case, Rob Reiner, this was only the beginning of a huge career. I mean, Sally Struthers tells me that toward the end of All in the Family, Rob was eagerly watching the sitcom's directors to see how it is they did the tricks they did, because he was so intent on being a director himself, and that he already had optioned The Princess Bride by the time that All in the Family was ending. And he was kind of chomping at the bit at the end of All in the Family to go off and be a director and writer, producer. So with him, I almost am embarrassed to ask him too many nitty gritty All in the Family questions. I'm not, because it's a classic, but to get into, like, in this episode, Mike said this silly thing. I'm like, I'm asking this guy who's gone on to write and direct and produce all these amazing films. So just talking with him and hearing the breadth of his experience, and yet how he's so willing to go back to All in the Family because he knows what a big deal it was, that's kind of flooring, that this was just one of the many jewels in his crown.
And Sally Struthers.
Sally Struthers has a great memory for all of this. Was really a revelation as Gloria, because it's hard to be in a foursome with Gene Stapleton and Carroll O'Connor, who were seasoned old actors with theater backgrounds, and really were heavy hitters. Even though they hadn't had a lot of TV experience, they were heavy hitters in acting. And Sally was young, in her early 20s. How do you, as somebody that young, have the gravitas to go toe-to-toe with them? And yet she did. And I think she was probably the pleasant surprise for everyone. Rob Reiner, also very young, but he came from the Reiner family. And I think because Norman knew Carl for decades, he knew Rob growing up. And so he knew how smart and talented Rob was. So Sally, I think, was probably the question mark going into the series. And there had been two other Glorias in the earlier pilots for ABC that hadn't been picked up. And so she was the third Gloria, and Rob was the third Mike, although the character was originally called Richard. And so I don't think Norman necessarily knew what he had in Sally until he tested her. And early in that first season, there's an episode where Gloria has a miscarriage, and she has really touching scenes, including one at the end of the episode with Carol, where it's father and daughter, and she says, "I guess you're disappointed in me, Daddy." And wow, does she stand up to Carol, and she's his equal in that scene. So talking with her and finding out, like, what had you done before All in the Family, and how did you do that? How did you not have how did you not get nervous going up against these other actors? And hearing she has great memory for detail. So we spoke for hours, and it was really fun. I think she was a little hesitant in the beginning to talk for the book because she has done other things and doesn't want to only talk about All in the Family all the time. And maybe had her issues. She did try to leave the show at one point and didn't. And so there were behind the scenes reasons why. I don't think she necessarily was eager to talk All in the Family from the start, but once she gets going, you hear the love she has for the show, for the character, for the cast, and how much she has committed that to memory.
And was there a Holy Grail interview that you went after that you got beyond the obvious that we've just stated?
Well, no, in that when you talk to the only two living major cast members, which would be Rob, Sally, you got the Holy Grail, and Norman, you got the Holy Grail. There were people who've passed away who would have been incredibly instrumental to the show that I couldn't talk to. I would say that I was proud of myself when I spoke to a writer named Irma Kalish, who was one of the earliest women writers for television, for sitcoms. And I talked to her when she was in the motion picture home at age 96. She passed away actually about a month ago.
Wow.
About a month ago. But I spoke to her about a year ago. And to find someone who was 96 years old and you talk All in the Family with her and she's right back there, that's what brings me joy. To show somebody at that age who was near the end of her life that she still appreciated. That to me is the Holy Grail. Were
there many women writers on the show?
No, there were more than typical. So in the 70s, if you look at the writing staff credits at the end of an episode for any 70s show, you will see the same names. Usually from the names, you can judge that they're probably white guys. TV was not a diverse place. Diversity is still an issue in casting and staffing of television today, although it's much more diverse today than it ever was. But back then, there weren't many writers of color, and there weren't too many women. Now, Irma was one of the women. There were a few others, and there would be women who would come in and get to do one episode as a freelancer, and that was a way to break into television, and for young writers as well. So there were women in that regard. But what I also was impressed with was Jean Stapleton came from, I would say, a very maybe sheltered is the word to use background, in that she was a Christian Scientist. She lived in Pennsylvania. Even though she was an actress, it was a pretty quiet life at this playhouse in Pennsylvania with her husband and her son, her daughter. And so when she was an East Coast actor, she wasn't, you think of actresses on Broadway and you think of the character in Bolts Over Broadway, don't speak. And you think about there must be debauchery and drinking and gin mills every night. That was not Jean's life. But when Jean gained national attention with Edith Bucker and saw not only the attention, but the responsibility that came with that character in terms of women looking up to her or wanting to not be like Edith, but Edith being a straw man for people to react to, Jean became much more actively involved in the women's movement and she spoke at the women's conference, and she talked about how she had kind of like a political awakening at a later age based on being on All in the Family. And so Jean advocated for women writers for the show. And it was thanks to her that several women got their chance on the show, because she said, I will come back for that 8th year or whatever it was. It was one of the later seasons, on the condition that you bring some more women in here. And so she really went to bat for women writers. And that's, again, another way that the show was different from what was happening at the time and really breaking ground.
But she took this role very seriously. She never made fun of that character outside of the realms of the show. And she would not go into other areas that would make fun of the character. She was very, very serious about how that character was taken. Does the book also go into the other layers of the show? In other words, Archie Bunker's place? Does it go beyond, the sitcoms that came out of the All in the Family?
We do discuss them. We're not in great depth because, as I said, there was so much All in the Family that we could have devoted pages to. But yes, we talk about how it evolved into Archie Bunker's place. We talk about the importance of spinning off the Jeffersons. And there is a section about the many spinoffs that resulted from All in the Family and from its spinoffs. So yeah, All in the Family became a cottage industry. When you think of all of the shows that followed it, I think it was a total of, including All in the Family, 7 shows that were begotten by the original Archie Bunker and Company. It's pretty amazing.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for being here today. But before you go, I always end my show. This is my little homage to Inside the Actors Studio and James Lipton. So I've got some random questions that I'm going to throw at you. These are not his questions. These are just some questions that I pulled. What is the best example of perfection that you can think of?
The best example of perfection? Oh, I don't know. I think that when you look at something in nature, the first thing that comes to my mind is the peacock feather. I mean, what a brilliant geometrical design. And that could only have come from the perfection that is nature.
That's a beautiful answer. In what way are you most understood?
Most understood. I think when people share my fandom for television and know, like for the Golden Girls, why it's so important to me as a gay man, me as a viewer of a certain age. I think when you have that communal understanding of a show, I think it's like a lot of straight people, I should say straight people, gay people do this too, but I don't. Like a lot of people feel about sports, and they commune over winning their team winning the game, and I don't get it at all. But I have that feeling of being a part of a community and then therefore being understood when people bond over these shows with me.
That's a great answer. I get that now. Who is the person that you miss the most right now in your life?
Well, it's always hard not to say my mother or my father, because that's the answer. My mother and father-in-law too. I mean, I've lost them all. If you talk outside the family, I mean, I think it might be B. Arthur. I was only getting to know her when she passed away, and she was fascinating, and she was a tough cookie and a tough nut to crack to get to know her, but I was starting to get there. And what a many-layered woman she was, because people thought because she seemed tough on the outside that she was tough, and that's the way to engage with her, and that's completely wrong. Such a mushball and vulnerable, and had so much to offer, not only in comedic talent, but also just as a person. She was so warm when you got to know her that I really wish that had gotten deeper before she passed away.
Great. And what was the best vacation that you ever took?
I just took a vacation to Hawaii with Frank, my husband, for our 25th anniversary. And you cannot beat the Isle of Kauai. Yes, it was great. You can't beat the Isle of Kauai. It cost a fortune. The food's expensive. It was COVID. There were shortages. I don't care. Those beaches, the hikes, there's nothing more perfect.
Wow, that's great. And you had Frank with you.
Yes.
That's more perfect than that. That's great.
Exactly.
What is the one non-monetary thing that you have the highest hope of obtaining in life?
Oh, an Emmy for writing a great episode of television. I still want to get there. I still want, as I said, I have things to say and want to say them. And I don't even care if I get the Emmy, if I get to air a show that says what I want to say, but the Emmy sure would be nice.
Well, I'm going to put those thoughts out there.
Thank you.
Where is the greatest place other than Hawaii that you've ever been?
I don't think that you can ever go wrong by naming any artistic or cultural site in Italy, because or Notre Dame in Paris, and I'm sure there are sites in the Eastern world that would match that in terms of what I'm about to say, in terms of the craftsmanship, the painstaking artistry, the faith that went into building these things. Some of these cathedrals, you stand there and realize, not only am I awed by the work of someone who was alive 800 years ago and whom I never had any chance of meeting, but that person worked her whole lifetime on a cathedral that wouldn't be finished in his or her whole lifetime, and they just had faith that the next generation would finish it. And that it makes you feel so small and yet so awed. So I just think you pick any of those, you pick the Vat of St. Peter's, you pick Notre Dame, you just stand there and think, oh my God, the amount of time and talent that it took to build this, and I get to experience it this many years later.
That's great. When do you love yourself the most?
when I get to do something nice for somebody, especially if they don't know it. I mean, that's when that's when I appreciate myself the most. That doesn't happen all that often. I try, but it feels good to be able to do that.
And my last question to you is, what would you most readily die for?
Oh, there's not a lot. I don't really want to die. I mean, saving somebody I love would be the only reason that it would be worth trying.
Well, I love you. I am so glad that you said yes to me. Don't go anywhere for a minute. I want to thank everybody for being here today. I'm sure I can speak for Jim when I say this. I don't take it for granted that you could have been anywhere else for the last hour. Those of us in this business, if you spend an hour with us, if you spend 30 minutes watching All in the Family, if you spend an hour anywhere, 30 minutes, we appreciate it. So thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this show, my hope is I'm getting rid of the word subscribe because I think it lessens who you are. Join the Skipper crew. Sign up right here on Richard Skipper Celebrates. Hit the like button. Leave a comment. Share this video with your friends. My goal is to celebrate. There are over 300 people that I have celebrated right here, artists right here on this channel. Check them out. Celebrate Jim Colucci. Check out the over 300 people that I hope that I will be celebrating ahead of us. I also end every show by telling everyone to go out and do something nice for somebody else without expecting anything in return. This is what I would like you all to do. I would like you to go to your favorite bookseller, and I would like you to order 2 copies of All in the Family, the show that changed television. I would like you to keep 1 copy for yourself, and then I want you to go to your Facebook friends list, and I want you to send a copy to the 3rd name that pops up, because they're going to appreciate this book. We've got to get this book, and we're going to get it on the #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. We're going to do this for Jim, and we're going to get it.
And do it for Norman at 99. Doesn't Norman deserve a bestseller?
He deserves it as well. So we're going to get it there. And again, I always end every show, again, pick up the phone, call your best friend, let them know what they mean to you. Because as my dear friend David Friedman says, we're all in this together, but we're not in the same boat. And I always say, if you're going to be out in a boat, make sure you bring a skipper along. Now, Jim, I'm going to leave the screen, and I'm going to give you the final word. Anything that you want to say about anything that we talked about today that you want to build upon, anything that we didn't talk about that you wish that we had said, or just any message that you want to put out to anyone that is watching right now, you've got the final word. Don't worry about how to end the show. As soon as you give the kiss off, I will end the show. Thank you for being here today. Thanks for the gifts that you've given to the world and that you're going to continue to give to the world. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. You've got the stage.
Oh my gosh, the pressure's on. This builds upon what I said about when you asked what I wanted people to get from the book. I think that television is one way that we're all in this together, and it's one of the benefits of being a human civilization that we are now. For as much as we divide ourselves, there are vehicles like All in the Family and media in general, like television, that really have the power to bring us all together. And I hope we do that more. I think that we should realize that this is a medium that only came about in the 20th century. And for as many bad things that happened in the 20th century and environmentally, how we've been destroying the planet since the 19th and 20th centuries, we like to be down on ourselves. But I think that the positive message is on the plus side, we also created this medium that is around the world, accessible to everyone. And when we create content for it, like All in the Family, there's room for all kinds of content. There's room for stuff that's just candy for the brain and is just empty calories. But when you create content that comes from the heart and comes from someone with something to say, or someone who wants to change the world, like Norman Lear, this is a medium that's incredibly powerful. And when I think about how it has shaped my life and informed my views in ways that I might not have gotten some of those viewpoints living in a more conservative household, I'm just thankful that I was alive and am alive at the time that I am, despite the problems we have now. and can continue to hopefully watch and maybe write some stuff that will help us all get more on the same page and do some of the things we need to do, including to the environment, to keep improving mankind. Boy, that sounds really, really high-minded of me. It sounds a little bit preaching of me, but I really do feel that strongly about the power of TV. And I hope you all do too. And I hope that books like this will help you appreciate that and realize that we really have so much in common that we can unite around. So thank you so much. And thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure being here with you. And I really appreciate it. And here's my kiss. Goodbye, everybody. Mwah.